Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Support the broadcast. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. A little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year. We do private weekly chats with members only. We bring back past podcast guests on occasion to do a live Q&A. And I do a weekly roundup of the news with a brief commentary for paid subscribers only. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Wise, Donor Box, and other options. And you can purchase a consult chat with me. Our sponsor this month is Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Summit. It's taking place from October 7th to the 11th. It's online for free for the first 24 hours. After that, you do have to purchase the VIP upgrade. If you decide to do that, use the promo code EMPIRE. You'll get $100 off. I am participating in one of the VIP panels on World War III. And at the summit, basically the topic will be internationalization, getting second, third, or fourth residencies, passports, purchasing offshore property, basically, batting down the hatches for the Great Reset. And most of the headline speakers have been guests on this podcast: Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Mark Faber, and a number of others. The link is in the description to register. Check out the affiliates of Geopolitics and Empire over at the website, geopoliticsandempire.com, and leave a podcast review, por favor. Joining us is Michael J. Sutton, who has been a political economist, professor, priest, pastor, and now a publisher. He's the CEO of Freedom Matters Today, looking at freedom from a Christian perspective. The website is freedommatterstoday.com. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire.
No, thank you very much, Favore. Very happy to be with you.
We've talked over the past couple of years many times on my old TNT radio program. And so it's your first time here on Geopolitics and Empire. And if you want to just tell us a bit for the audience who are not familiar with yourself, you're out there down under in Australia. If you want to tell us a bit about the work you do at Freedom Matters Today.
Yeah, you're happy to. Thank you, Favore. Freedom Matters Today looks at freedom from a Christian perspective, and I've tackled fascism, COVID hysteria, what it means to be a Christian following Jesus in these times. I've written about what some call Christian nationalism. I've written about our relationship with Russia. My book, Is Russia Our Enemy?, is one of the books that Amazon won't advertise, but you can still purchase from Amazon, but you can't. I'm not allowed to advertise that book because it fails the community standards for some reason. Then I've also written about does God stand with Israel, a Christian response to Gaza. So for the last few years, I've taken various issues of importance to Christians, and I've tried to present a biblical Christian perspective on those issues. And Freedom Matters Today is really the emphasis, because what we saw with COVID hysteria and with the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates and passports and so on, was the absence of our freedom, abrogation of our freedom, the theft of our freedom. And it really was an attack on Christianity. And Jesus said, it is if the Son of Man has come to set you free, if the Son of Man has set you free, then you're truly free. And Paul said that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And we lived at a time during the COVID lockdowns where the church said, no, that's not true. Freedom is not important. You have to adopt the passports and accept the lockdowns and take the vaccine. And none of this was true. None of it was Christian. And they created COVID theology, which was a theology to justify this form of I guess, capitulation in return for large amounts of money. And as I point out in my book, Freedom from Fascism, what happened in Australia and also in the United States is the greatest transfer of funds from the government to the church in living memory in return for silence and complicity. And so the churches did very well out of COVID because, their silence was bought effectively. And even today in Australia, the ripple effect of COVID hysteria is that any of the Christians who supported the lockdowns, passports, and mandates, their careers have sort of gone up, been elevated. And those who didn't toe the line, who stood for faith and freedom, their careers have sort of been going down, or marginalized, or expelled, or silenced. And so for me, this was a loyalty test And what we've seen since COVID is another series of successions of loyalty tests. And so that's what I've been, I guess, charting through, of course, first COVID. Well, actually, it started with Trump, and then it's with COVID and Gaza and other things, World War III. And so there's all these loyalty tests. So Freedom Matters Today started with COVID hysteria, and then I've moved looking at various loyalty tests and looked at it from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I recently had on a guest who used to work in biotech and science, Mike Donio, who, as you say, people who decided to stand up really have a difficult time finding jobs, feeding their families, being ostracized. And we could perhaps start with what's happening in Israel, Gaza. I've touched on that topic in passing with guests, and I think the state of Israel is not, to say the least, behaving very well. A lot of people will use this opportunity to throw the baby out with the bathwater, Christianity. But in fact, I see it as the inverse, because you mentioned all these churches falling by the wayside, right? And what does Jesus say? He says, when I come back, will I find anyone who believes? He's implying that as we progress, more and more churches will become false churches, false believers. And so I think there's no way to excuse what is happening in Gaza. I mean, there's a clip perhaps you saw the other day, two I think it was called Two Nice Jewish Boys or something. So two Israelis discussing if there was a button that would wipe every living human being out, Gazan from Gaza, that they would press that button. That clearly is not a Christian thing to do. The Christian thing is to love your enemy, to feed the poor, protect innocent life. And so, what's your if you want to tell us about your book, Does God Stand with Israel? A Christian Response to Gaza?
Yeah, no, happily. So here's the book. It's called Does God Stand with Israel? And a Christian Response to Gaza. And it's about 250 pages long. It was a podcast series I gave this year. And the podcast series is still available at freedommatterstoday.com and through Spotify, where most people listen to the podcast. So I wanted to ask the question, does God stand with Israel? Because this is another loyalty test that have been shoved down our throats, particularly in the churches where Christians have been told, well, you have to stand with Israel. You're not allowed to have an alternative opinion. And it really hinges on the question of genocide. And so what I did in the book and what I did in the series was plumb the depths of one of the most difficult questions the Bible proposes and talks about, and that is genocide. And we see in Israel, there's obvious genocide taking place in Palestine, in Gaza, and there's been a lot of discussion about this and a lot of evidence for this, assassination of journalists, the destruction of the cultural identity of the people, the thousands and thousands of children being killed. And it's an appropriate time to talk about the death of innocents. Today in Australia, it's September 11. In America, I think it's September 10th, but tomorrow is September 11. So I think we should acknowledge the terrible events of September 11, where 3,000 or so innocent people were killed as a result of the violent attack on the United States. And the reverberation of that event is still occurring, and like the ripple effects are still going out from the American society. I don't think America's really overcome or really come to terms with that in any real comprehensive sense. But on that day, 3,000 people were killed, and they were innocent people going about their lives, and their lives came to an end. And so it's 3,000 families, and more than that were directly affected. And so what's happening in Gaza today is that over 40,000 innocent people have been killed. Thousands and thousands of children have been killed. More children have been killed in Gaza than the complete death toll of 9/11. And this should fill us with horror and revulsion and disgust. And but what in the Christian community, many of them, particularly Protestants, my tribe, Protestants, many evangelicals, Pentecostals, evangelicals, or whatever, I feel that I'll come back to it later about tribes. But as far as my tribe is concerned, there's been silence, almost silence. And the idea is, well, we can't talk about that, because if we criticize what's happening, then we're doing what God wants, and God wants us to stand with the state of Israel. And it ties in, of course, with all this theology that they've created about the end of the world and the return of the state of Israel and the return of the nation of Israel. But it avoids the question. The question is that as Christians, we are to show mercy and compassion to everyone made in the image of God. And everyone in the world today is made in the image of God. And so every time you meet someone, doesn't matter who you meet, someone you don't like, they have been made in the image of the Creator. And the teachings of the New Testament are that Jesus is the full identity of God. So as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the presence, the power, and the person of God. And so God is making us into his identity. So the Christian is being recreated into the identity of Christ, the presence of God in the world. And so what we have in Gaza is this genocide. And a lot of Christians have said, no, it's not genocide. And what has astounded me is, as you said in your introduction, those two boys talking about a computer game, and it kind of reminded me of a Star Trek episode just then, which we could talk about later. But it's the same thing, and there's all this just debate about, in the conduct of the war, the death toll ratio has been acceptable, and only a certain number of people are being killed. Look, if you've ever known someone who's been shot, the effect of someone being shot or blown to bits is pretty terminal in the life of a child or an adult, and the effects of war are horrific. There was that Olympian who, I think it was the high jump or one of those sports in the Paralympics. He was in Afghanistan. He trod on a mine and both his legs were blown off, and so he wins the gold medal, but he was scarred for life. And it's a story of triumph of him overcoming that. But the fact is, it wouldn't have happened had he not trod on a mine and had his legs blown off. There's all this sort of human element that is missed in this discussion, because Christians are more interested in the sort of theology that God wants. But God said, through Jesus, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." And this implies, of course, that if you're not a peacemaker, you're not a child of God. Jesus had all these sort of sayings where he'd say something to promote a particular idea, but of course the reverse of it was quite offensive. And so that is quite offensive. Those who do not promote peace are not the children of God. It's fairly simple. And so in my book, I looked at divine genocide in the Old Testament, and I did what most Christians don't do, and that's have a pretty honest look at what was going on in the Old Testament. And it's very dark. It's very dark. And the question that you're immediately confronted with before the creation of the kingdom of Israel under David. So David is regarded as in a sense, the founder of Israel. There's Saul was his predecessor, but Saul's reign was a little bit of a disaster because he failed. He refused to commit genocide against the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. And so Saul refused to commit genocide, and he does partial genocide, but he wants to keep all the animals and a few other people for himself, and so he incurs the wrath of God. But once David is there, David is the founder of Israel. But up to that point, divine genocide is really essential to the creation of the people of Israel. And God tells the Israelites to commit genocide in his name through the prophets, through Samuel, and then through what happens in the past. And these are really dark questions. Is God the author of genocide? And so I plumbed the depths of all this. And have you come across these discussions, Savore?
Not very often, but my view has been the same for many years, where I just sort of in those times accept God is he's the creator, he's the author, and that was his purpose then to protect what would ultimately be the gospel, and what would ultimately become the gospel and the message to save the whole world. Because even back then people could join the Israelites, convert and believe in God, and even that would still imply believing in Jesus. And so I sort of the way I view it is, in the Old Testament times, I sort of accept Because a lot of those other groups were, non-believers, pagans, and doing all sorts of things. But, when Christ comes, I just view it as different. Like today, it's, he died for humanity, and many of the Christians, and after Christ came, were being martyred. So the way today is not one of war, but of, I guess, martyrdom.
Yeah, well, I would agree. I think you've hit the nail on the head, but I would extend it actually into the Old Testament period, and I would argue that the Israelites were thinking about exactly the same thing. And so what you have in the Old Testament is a struggle between the idea of God as judge and the idea of God as I guess, love. And so love and righteousness go together. And there's these competing traditions in the Old Testament. And there's some bizarre stories in Genesis, of course, where we have the flood. The flood is divine genocide against humanity. And an echo of the flood, of course, is when the angel of the Lord destroys the cities of the plain. But there you have a real twist in it, and that is that Abram starts to argue with God over whether God will inflict judgment or not. And so Christians won't pray to God properly. In the Lord's will, if it's the Lord's will. But Abraham takes God on and says, if there's 50 people in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, will you not relent? And God says, oh, okay. And then he bargains God down. This is a man talking to God, challenging God, saying, look, I want to hold you accountable because you've told me that all these people are made in your image. These people are, in a sense, an extension of your identity. And so in Genesis, as we have this beginning of this dialogue with God, and then that's the end of it in a way. And then, of course, when the Israelites leave Egypt and they go into the promised land, into the land promised, they engage in this genocide of the various towns. But then once the monarchy is established under David, there's no more genocide in Israel. And it's as if there's a shift in the structure of society. There's the chaos of the pre-tribal society. And once it's established as a kingdom, it sort of stops. And the kings continue. And so it's a very fascinating part of the Old Testament. But then something absolutely terrible happens at the end of the kingship period, which is the fall of Jerusalem in 586, 587 BC. And so what you have is divine genocide again against God's own people, the people of Israel. And so up until Kings, the end of Kings, you have this absence of genocide. The establishment of Israel is based on genocide. And then once you have the fall of Jerusalem in 586, 587 BC, you have the fall of Jerusalem. And the entire Old Testament from then is really a discussion about what that means for the people of Israel. And so by the time Jesus comes along, 500 or 600 years later, he is the one who is, in a sense, it's a New Testament. It's the fulfillment of the Old. So the Old Testament ends with the arrival of Christ and the New Testament begins. And what Christian Zionists have done is that they say, no. Everything about the Old Testament, we delete Jesus from our theology and we're bringing it all forward to the end of the world. And they say, but it's the enemy from the north is coming from Ezekiel. Yes, it's the fall of Jerusalem. But it's Russia. It's got to be Russia. It's not Russia. It's not Russia. It wasn't even in the cosmology of the ancient Israelites. What you're talking about is exactly what Americans are still talking about today, which is September 11. So American culture and political culture is still living under the shadow of September 11. So it doesn't matter. We're talking about fascism. We're talking about the surveillance state. We're talking about terrorism. All of this, in a sense, is an echo of September 11. We're still living under that shadow, in a sense, umbrella event. And so for the people of Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all those great prophetic texts, which Christian Zionists say is what's going to happen in the future in Israel today, that's all a discussion about why did God destroy Jerusalem? And that is the key traumatic event. It is for Israel, of course, it's the Holocaust of the Old Testament. And it's the great event. And even today, we still struggle. Why did God destroy Jerusalem. Why did he destroy it? Jeremiah, who was the first political scientist in history, he was saying for 40 or 50 years why it was going to fall, and they just ignored him and said, no, we're God's people. God, we're the nation. We're blessed by God. God bless Israel. We will never fall. And Israel fell. And so the book is a discussion about Abraham. I look at the life of Abraham. I look at what Abraham says to us today. I believe that Abraham is the model of the kind of man we need today in Israel. Modern Israelis, modern Arabs can learn a lot from Abraham, and he does, in a sense, unite many of the faith traditions in the way that he talks about God, the way that he relates with each other. And it's a discussion that Christians don't want to talk about. But Christian Zionism, of course, is not interested in understanding how we fit into the plan of God. They're more interested in promoting a particular ideology which they've stolen from the Old Testament. And the other thing is that Christian Zionism is not Zionism. Zionism is a Jewish movement which began in the 19th century and evolved into the creation of the State of Israel. But Christian Zionism is not Christian, and it's not Zionist because it's actually not. It's sort of what you call spiritual plagiarism in a way, kind of borrowing ideas. And so I would apologize to Zionists for saying, well, Christian Zionism is not related to Zionism. It's not connected to it. And in fact, as I say in the book, my warning to the State of Israel is this: the people who persecuted you for 2,000 years are now suddenly your friends. Really? Wow. As Jeremiah would say, a leopard doesn't change his spots, nor a European his prejudice. So we have to be very careful about the people we trust, because if for 2,000 years a particular group has hated the Jews, suddenly they're the friends of the Jews? Yeah, well, time will tell. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I take a nuanced approach. I see there's different extremes. So you've got the Christian Zionist camp in one, right? And then you've got the other extreme of tend to be leftists who dislike religion or Christianity and Israel. And I wouldn't call myself pro-Palestinian, but neither am I a Christian Zionist because, like you said, I think both groups, the Israelis and Palestinians and Jews, should be treated all as God, made in the image of God, right, and respected to the utmost. And it's often, again, I kind of step back because for me, this is the Bible often talks about Jerusalem, Israel being this rock that just the whole world gets hung up on. And in some ways, I do view the creation of the state of Israel as a supernatural event, but I view a lot of the prophecies as being stated sort of matter of factly. I had a guest recently, David Haggith, who said he quoted, I think, from Isaiah, woe to the people who try to get involved actively in shaping future events. So these things are going on. God uses the good people and God uses the bad people to bring things about. But I'm not going to be. I think to support the state of Israel in carrying out atrocities is not something we should be doing. We should be calling them out on it. In many ways, I view the state of Israel today as being like a rebellious child. So they've rejected the Messiah. They're behaving rebelliously. Nonetheless, though, at some point, I could see possibly God still, redeeming a group of, because it says people from all tribes will be saved, right? And then the end will come. So from every people group, there will become Christian believers. And so I just sort of view Israel today as this disobedient child. As you've sort of mentioned, they have been throughout history. And so, any final thoughts on Gaza, Israel, and then we could look at the wider war as well.
Yeah, I think you've introduced a really important dimension there, Havore, and it relates to the way we deal with prophecy, the way we deal with God. Jesus tells Peter when he meets Peter, the apostle, the first time. Peter says in one of the Gospels he feels he's in the presence of the divine, so he feels his own sin. He says, Lord, stay away from me, I'm a sinful man. So there's this encounter with the divine. He feels unworthy, and Jesus doesn't say, yes, Peter, you're a dirty sinner. He says to him, follow me. That's it. And at the end of the gospel, when everyone's wondering what Jesus wants to, what the ministry of John will be, Peter asks Jesus, "Hey Jesus, what about John? What about him?" And at the end, the last words that Jesus has for Peter is, "Peter, follow me." And so Christians are called simply to follow Christ and leave the rest to God. Leave a lot of the ambiguity to God. We cannot change the mind of God. God's got his plan. But I think what the state of Israel has to say to us today, and that is, and it relates very much to what's happening in Australia, and maybe a lot more in Australia, but maybe in the United States, and that's question of legitimacy. And that is that when the state of Israel was formed after the war, it was a result of war and conflict. And there's the civil war. The Palestinians call it the Nakba. There are lots of terrible things happened. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of massacres and so on. But the Israelis prevailed, and they created their state. And then in 1967, there's another war. And the Israelis have won 2 wars. Now, according to the ancient laws of the establishment of government, which has existed since the very beginning of time, whoever wins has legitimate government. And what the United Nations has come in and said, and others, no, you don't. For some reason, we're going to exempt Israel from legitimacy. You don't have legitimacy. And if that's the case, then Australia, America, Canada, our legitimacy is called into question because we're settler colonies. South Africa. Then let's go back further. We'll go right back in history to when the Celts were kicked out of England. We'll go back to Japan when the Yamato people came in 700 AD and they kicked out the Ainu and pushed them up to Hokkaido. So where do we go back to? Where's our starting point? We have to accept the legitimacy of the state. And so for me, my understanding of Israel is that the legitimacy of the Israeli state is not in question. What is in question is the way they I guess, manage their authority and those under their responsibility. And it's been a complete and utter catastrophe. But when you look at the Old Testament, they were facing exactly the same problem. So in the days in the genocide was kill, kill, kill. But once David set up his territory, if you look at the story of Samuel and Kings, David brings in all these groups of people under his leadership. These people aren't Israelites. Uriah the Hittite, he's not an Israelite. And so there's this story in ancient Israel where Israel actively brings in all these non-Israelites under the banner of Israel, and it becomes a richer place. And then at the time of Jesus, you have the proselytes, and these are people who were not Jewish, who are, I guess, converted to Judaism. We don't actually know when that began in earnest. We know that Herod was a convert. He was forcibly converted. The Jews never liked Herod, even though he built them a temple. They hated him, even though I kind of feel sorry for the Herods in a way, but they were political appointees of Rome. But at the time of Jesus, there are all these characters who were converted to Judaism. So when you read the New Testament and the Gospels, every time you meet someone who's not Jewish, there's the centurion, is one example. There's Philip meets the Ethiopian in the desert and baptizes him. He is a proselyte. It says he's come back from Jerusalem. Why was he in Jerusalem? He went to the temple. He went to worship Yahweh. And so they have a tradition where they do bring all these other groups under their banner. And what they haven't done well at all, Israel, is that they haven't done that in Israel today. And that's the ultimate failure of the Israeli state. And we have a result, the conflict, the war, the persecution of Palestinians, and so on. And it dovetails with Australia and with America. And so Australia was conquered. The British Crown conquered Australia, established the Crown. In America, the settlers came and took the land from the Native Americans. But no one should question the legitimacy of the state once they're created. It's the responsibility of states to look after everyone under their care, which really is the measure of true legitimacy. And it relates as much to Australia as it does to Israel.
Yeah, I mean, my view was I read the book Startup nation. It talks about the miracle of Israel, that it was a desert, and now it's this. I visited Israel. It's this successful nation. They export flowers from the desert. And all that, and I thought, why not have one state where you incorporate, if it's such a wealthy country, you give full citizenship to the people in Gaza, in the West Bank.
Yeah.
Let them live flourishing lives just like the others. But then the problem that I've read from some of the Israelis themselves is they will then breed, and then if they have a democracy in Israel over time, I guess non-Jewish Israelites, or Muslim Israelis, or whatever, Arab Israelis will come to outnumber the Jews, and they don't want that either. And so now they've just gone for this aggressive, as you said, imperial expansionist policy. And I saw a quote the other day in the U.S. about reparations. It just made me think. I don't know if it was from Chicago, where I'm from, where they're trying to pass these laws about reparations, or it was a meme in California saying, people who were never slaves, the current descendants, are asking people who never were slave owners, white Americans, to pay reparations in a state that did not allow slaves, if I'm not mistaken, California. And I'm just thinking, from my research, the etymology of the word slave comes from Slav, because Slavs were enslaved en masse by the Arabs or the Turks.
Yeah.
I'm a Slav. So I'm thinking, like, well, where are my reparations? That, using the same logic, where are my reparations? And I should de facto be exempt from having to pay into any reparations, because the word slave came from my forefathers and my people. So it's kind of to your point earlier, where does this stuff end? And then to talk about the wider war, because you've got a book on that. We've talked about that a bit on TNT radio, and it's just expanding. I mean, it's going crazy. One flashpoint could be Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran. You've got Ukraine, Russia, the whole of Europe. You've got NATO preparing for war in Asia. Aggressively, arming Philippines, the Japanese, what they want South Korea to get nukes, Australia, and to encircle China, really. And so I just feel it's inevitable at some point, unfortunately. And I do what I can. I'm a former educated professor, so this is sort of my job. And I was thinking the other day, I'm proud that I've been able to spar with the deep state. That I get the Department of Homeland Security take me down from PayPal. That was April 2022. I think perhaps because of my anti-war narrative, right? Questioning the official war narrative. Because those of us that got taken down in that week of April were myself, Consortium News, which is a left-wing anti-war outlet, Mint Press News, which is left-wing anti-war outlet, and Caleb Maupin, which is I'm like the only non-leftist in that group. But anyways, your thoughts on where we are headed when it comes to the Third World War?
I just want to finish with an analogy with Israel and Gaza, and it's terrible, the genocide that's occurring there. But I think for the Israelis, one of their key problems, it's like you're in a tug of war. Do you have tug of war in America where you've got, so on one side, imagine Israel's in the middle. That's Israel. On one side, you've got Iran, and the other side, you've got America. And they're kind of pulling both sides. And they can't really come to terms with who they are as a people because of this pressure from both sides. And in a sense, it's a struggle that many nations have, is that we can't find our own independence, our own territorial integrity, because we are actually being pulled in different directions. But for me, the answer always is going back to the Bible. And for Jewish people, if they won't accept Christ, they need to go back to understanding the humanity of people found as an image of God. Everyone's made in the image of God. And the example of Abraham as a man who lived at peace with his neighbors. He interceded for his neighbors. He protected his neighbors. They respected him. He respected them. So that Abraham is a great model. And for Christians, Christ is our model. Christ is saying that blessed are the peacemakers. And it comes down to, again, once again, we're at a time, as you say, Havore, that We are now, every time we talk, there's some new crisis. I feel like the last time we spoke, there was a crisis. Every time we talk, there's some new disaster about to be inflicted upon us. But I believe we are already in World War III, the conflict with Russia. We are now at war with Russia. Australia, the West, is now at war with Russia. It's very clear there are American troops, Western troops on the ground in Russia fighting alongside Ukrainian troops. The incursion into Russia is an invasion, first time since the days of Hitler. And the propaganda machine is in full swing. And Australia, of course, we have a funny spy agency in Australia, and that is that he's always on the news talking about things. And for me, my understanding, that the CIA have less public exposure than Australian security agencies. The point of a spy agency is you don't actually promote yourself publicly. You work behind the scenes. But in Australia, they've arrested two Russian spies, allegedly, who weren't guilty of espionage, but they were guilty of preparing for espionage. And they're going to be prosecuted and put through the courts. One of them was a caravan repairman. He was very strategically located to inflict maximum damage on the second-hand rental caravan market in Australia, which would, of course, cripple the nation. And his partner was a private, I think, private in the Australian Army. Of course, she was well placed to access high-level security information. It tells you about how secure the Australian security system is. Kind of reminds me of the British Secret Service in the 50s. But these two people were hauled over the coals. They've been arrested and prosecuted. But what we weren't told until recently was that there was an Indian spy cell operating in Australia for a number of years, spying on Australia, on Australians, and that was kind of swept under the carpet. It was acknowledged by the government, oh yes, it's an Indian spy cell. But all the time previously it was called a Russian spy cell because it was the Russians, because the Indians, our allies, would never spy on us. Of course they would. Why wouldn't they? They're one of the largest countries in the world. And so they were spying on us. But the most recent revelation by the spy services was that they're going to force the encrypted email servers and companies to give up all their encrypted emails, and so you won't be allowed to send emails that are encrypted anymore. And so that's another extension of the surveillance state, because after all, they're looking after us. They're protecting us, aren't they, from the enemy, which is Russia, and soon to be China. And so, as you probably know, Australia is now going to be the host of Japanese troops in the north end of Australia, up in Darwin, a place where they bombed over 80 years ago, as part of their invasion plans to invade Australia. And they're going to be stationed there along with 2,500 US Marines on a rotational basis as part of the staging ground for our war with China, which we're going to provoke. Well, we won't. I won't provoke anything. But the Americans will provoke with China over Taiwan. And that will, of course, lead to the collapse of the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. And that'll go to America probably, or Europe, or Japan maybe. They might be lucky with a few companies. And the Taiwanese will be sent back to the Stone Age. And, of course, parts of China will be sent back to the Stone Age. They're going to sit there as well. The Chinese are just going to let it happen. They're going to wait until the American bombers are bombing Beijing. They won't do anything. They won't attack. They won't retaliate. And so there's this strange preparation for war that is taking place at the backdrop of the US presidential election. I don't think Americans realize that the logistical preparation for war with China is almost set. It's ready to go. And when Trump gets elected, if he gets elected, it'll be war with China. And if Kamala Harris gets elected, she probably won't go to war with China immediately, but she'll continue war with Russia. And so we're living in this time of war, as you know. We are now in World War III. And I wrote a book which hasn't been banned by Amazon, called World War III, Will You Stand for Peace? I love the colours. And I chose the colours deliberately, and I won't talk about the colours in case the book is banned, but I was being very facetious and controversial in the colours of the book. I like the book, and it has a picture of a Russian tank on the front, which I took when I was in Russia. It's a nice white tank, and it fits well with the cover. And Amazon won't ban this, but they will ban this book, which is Does God Stand With Israel? Does God Stand With Israel doesn't meet their content requirements until the current crisis is over, which I assume is the Gaza war, the genocide maybe. So once there are a few more thousands of Palestinians have been murdered, this book will be available as an advertised commodity. You can still purchase it. My book on Russia I don't have with me, but that's been banned. But isn't it funny that the book on World War III, which has a Russian tank on the front and has interesting color scheme, is available through Amazon as an advertised commodity. So, yeah, I agree, Havori. What do you think? Do you think we're in the middle of World War III or in the beginning of it?
I'd agree with you. And it's, the World War III book is available on Amazon because, that's what they want in World War III. And then they don't want the other book because they don't want you to question the Israel-Gaza narrative. But just going back to China, I don't know if you were being, satirical or not, but do you think, if there was a conflict, China would be, they'd have, I think, a huge response.
Yeah.
No, and
absolutely.
I had a recent guest that said, this action would be coordinated with Russia, Iran, and China and their other allies. So basically, it'd be like for me, it'd be 50-50 up in the air.
Absolutely, I was being silly. There's no way, it's the same with Russia. Russia is an active participant in the conflict with Ukraine, and Russia is not going to sit back and let America tear it apart. And the same way China is not going to sit by and watch American bombers napalm Beijing. So I think the reality is it's strange and it's bizarre, and it's deeply, as an Australian, it's deeply offensive that Japanese troops would be allowed to come to Australia. And it's astounding that the Labor Party, which is probably the most useless party in Australian politics, and it's useless because in my perspective, is simple. When you're running for office, the policies that you promote must have at least some kind of resonance with the policies you pursue when you're in government. But they do the opposite. They don't actually pursue their own policies. And so there's been no discussion about the Japanese troops in the Australian Parliament. There's really been no discussion about any of the troop movements. And these are 80 years ago, the Japanese bombed Darwin. Over 200 people were killed. Then there's the death marches in the Southeast Asia, the Sandakan Death March. There's the persecution of the POWs, terrible suffering. There's, of course, the Bushido culture in Japan, which has never been exorcised from the national soul. And many Japanese today still believe that World War II or the Pacific War, the Asia-Pacific War, was justified, that they were on the right side of history. I even had a student when I was teaching at a graduate program. This is a master's level program in Japan. These were the elite students. And one of the students gave a presentation. I couldn't believe my ears. He was telling us that Japan won the war. He was convinced Japan had won the war. So at the end of his long speech, I asked the students, who were also graduate students, what's wrong with what he said? And they said, his talk was too long. I said, no. Is there anything else that was wrong with what he said? They had no idea. And I had to explain to them, look, you didn't win the war. You lost the war. The emperor capitulated. And they were astonished. Absolutely. I thought, what is going on here? And so you have a population, many in Japan, who still believe in the pre-war militarist view of Japan. The LDP, the political party in Japan, which has been in government forever, the democratically elected Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, the one-party state, they are far right. They're a traditional far right. They support the militarization of Japan. They support the old ways. They have a revisionist view of history. They don't understand this thing called history. And history is full of facts And the fact is that the Japanese Imperial Army went into Nanking and massacred hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And for a lot of Japanese, no, that never happened. That never happened. And we call it history. They call it American propaganda, Chinese propaganda. The Chinese hate Japan. And I don't think they're sort of similar to the Israeli-Palestinian thing, but this is real hatred. This is so deep, the enmity between Japan and China. And the Japanese don't get it. You know, they could go to war with anyone in the world, but whatever you do, don't ever think about going to war with China. It's the worst possible decision your country will ever make, because the Chinese will annihilate Japan. They'll have no qualm about leveling Japan. They absolutely hate each other because the Japanese have never come to terms with or apologized or repented of what happened in China. And they've apologized to Americans, of course, and to Australia and so on. Interesting, the Chinese never asked for reparations from Japan. And the answer is, well, it doesn't matter what you give us because it will never be enough for what you did to us. That's the Chinese way of thinking. And so for Japan to side itself with America and Australia to go to war with China, it is the worst mistake they will ever make. And if I was in Beijing, I wouldn't bother bombing America. I would go straight for Japan, because that's where there are 15 major military bases in Japan, US bases. There's over 50,000 American troops stationed in Japan. Korea, there's lots of American bases there. In Australia, there are American bases. So if we go to war with China, all of the region will be affected by war. And we have these things called missiles and these things called long-range missiles. And they go a long distance, a long way. And so China got them. Do you know when China developed these long-range missiles?
No, actually, I don't know the exact year. But when would that have been?
It was what prompted Nixon and Kissinger to do a deal with China. So the reason why America decided to become friends with China again under Nixon was the Chinese, however they had the money after the nightmare of the Cultural Revolution, they started creating these long-range missiles in the early 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, which could reach other parts of the archipelago of Asia. And so Nixon said, well, and Kissinger mainly said, we need to do a deal with China, because if China uses these missiles to start a war, the whole world will just go up in flames. And that's what motivated the American overtures of peace to China. And as a result, the Chinese Communist Party collapsed in a sense, and we have the rise of a market socialist system brought about by Kissinger and Nixon. Naughty Nixon, I suppose. But without Nixon, we wouldn't have China today, but now it doesn't matter because we're going to war with China anyway. As a capitalist, two capitalist industrial states going to war. And I can't see anything other than absolute catastrophe written all over it. How about you, Havore? What's your take on it?
No, I see the same. Many guests I have on the podcast, a lot of us see the same thing, where this momentum has been built and we're heading down this road. But something that you mentioned about the revisionist history and the view that Japanese have on the history, and recently I had to not approve a comment on YouTube. Maybe this person is listening, where they fired a shot across the bow where they insulted me by calling me Inusasha, which are like the Croatian sort of Croatian Nazis of the World War II era.
Oh, really?
My grandfather, my Croatian grandfather, had been a prisoner of I assume the Croatian Nazi regime. And it's funny, where I will rarely, when I talk to, I have friends that are Serbians, and I like to admit, I like to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I need to do a deeper dive on some of my own Balkan or Croatian history. But they talk about that the Croatian Nazi regime. We have to separate all these different things, just like a Japanese would separate the Imperial Japanese force and that biological warfare unit 7 something. I always forget the number, that carried out insane atrocities. We have to separate all these different things, and I'm sure there were atrocities carried out by this Croatian regime against Serbs and Jews. But I would also talk about, like the Chetniks would be the dark Serbian force that committed atrocities against Croats. But it's funny, when I talk to Serbs, some of them, it's not often that you'll have a group of people admit both, right? And so that's what I'm doing here. Croatian Ustaša did bad things, but so did the Serbian Chetniks. And so we kind of have to be really honest about all of this. I often find in history, there's very few good guys, usually. And then often it's people that are stuck with difficult choices that they have to make in extremely different circumstances. It's easy to look back now. And so, I think on the war front, it's just not good news. And I was thinking, all the themes we're touching on, the biblical times, we're talking about Israel, Gaza, and in my latest Substack write-up, I'm pointing out almost every week now, there are these Jewish interests who want to expand onto the Temple Mount, which has prophetic, as I call that, metaphysical implications. The latest was open Jewish prayer prostration on Temple Mount, now routine. And you've even had Erdogan of Turkey now calling for Islamic countries to form an alliance against Israel. So it's almost like we've got, and then in Turkey, I don't know if you saw a bunch of video clips coming out now of Turks shouting "Yankees go home," even putting a bag over the head of an American soldier. And so you've got these sort of like end times topics coupled with World War III, the economic chaos, and then tyranny, like the perfect storm. This is why for the past 10 plus years, as I've been teaching, almost since 2010, I've been telling students we are in a 1920s, 1930s scenario, and that couples with the tyrannies of the 20s and the 30s, the German, the Italian, the Soviet Russian, and we're seeing now in the West, in UK, Europe, Canada, USA, Australia, a rapid descent into totalitarianism with this technological tyranny, people being arrested now for thought crime. Basically, 1984 is now being made into law in the West. And we'll have our bank accounts shut off, we'll be arrested, jailed, fined. And so what do you make of the direction? And because we're Westerners, so what's happening in Russia and China, I'll leave that to the Russians and the Chinese. But I'm a European, I'm an American, also a Mexican, you're Australian, we're Westerners. And so I think we should be first foremost concerned with our country. So your thoughts on the descent into fascism?
Well, it goes back to what I was talking about with tribes. I'm very critical. I'm very critical of Western Christians because I'm a Western Christian. I'm very critical of my own tribe. I don't pull any punches. I'm very critical of Catholics and Protestants in that sense. But I don't say much about the Orthodox because they're not I really don't have much to say to them because they're not really part of my tradition. I respect them and I disagree with a lot of what Orthodoxy stands for. But at the same time, I think we do speak to our own people, and there are limits to what you can say really to people where there's no real background because you miss a lot of the context, and in some ways they have to fight their own battles. But I agree with you. This book, Baby Race, Low National Birth Rates, A Blessing or a Curse. This is a proof copy. I'm still editing it at the moment, but this book is arguing similar to what you're saying about we're going back to the 1920s, and so in terms of birth rates across high-income nations, right across the world, in high-income nations in the 1920s, you see the collapse of the birth rate as industrialization and so on pick up, and the creation of these new states like Italy and Germany and other places. But then you see the rise of fascism promoting more babies, which leads into World War II. And as a result of the war, we have the baby boom generation, and now we're going back to the 1920s with lower birth rates. So it's not that we're regressing. We are simply, we're recovering from the nightmare of World War II. It's taken us 100 years, but we're back to the 1920s. And so we have this wonderful opportunity. Where do we want to go as a society? Like a reset. It's a natural reset, but the great reset that people want is their own kind of top-down level reset. My message to them is, well, be careful what you wish for, because in revolutions, Mr. Schwab, what happens is that it's not Mr. Schwab and his friends who survive. They're the first to get killed. They're the first to get wiped out. Just look at the Russian Revolution. The ones who were the architect of the Russian Revolution, they all died very quickly, and then Lenin and his friends took over what was left. And so we have to be very careful about promoting these revolutions. And I think that the West has sort of returning to the 20s in many ways. And so we have this wonderful opportunity to create a positive future. But sadly, unfortunately, we are going back to the same thing that happened in the 20s, the rise of fascism. And what it was in the case of Germany and Italy and Japan, it was the collapse of democratic institutions. And so fascism always comes out of democratic institutions. That's my belief anyway. So Russia will never be a fascist country because it has no tradition of democracy. China can never be fascist because it has no tradition of democracy. It can be totalitarian, but it can't be fascist because fascism is a result of a collapsed democracy or delegitimized democracy. And so the question is, how far gone is America? How far gone is Australia? And there's all these contests taking place in parliaments, and new laws are getting passed. But the average person, of course, is on board with the vaccine mandates. They're on board with COVID hysteria. They're on board with war with Russia. Stand with Ukraine was the loyalty test. Now it's stand against China, stand with Taiwan. And the great tragedy, of course, is that Taiwan, there are, I think there's 10 million, no, 100,000 or something native Taiwanese, but they were always persecuted. They were kind of the meat in the sandwich from the beginning. There's about 11 or 12 ethnic groups in Taiwan, minority ethnic groups, are always there, persecuted by the Republic of China, persecuted by the Japanese, persecuted by Chiang Kai-shek, and then now they're being completely marginalized. They have no say in the future of their nation, which is, they've been marginalized. But the Taiwanese, the Chinese Taiwanese were members of the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek's group, who left China. And so the argument that Taiwan is not part of China, well, of course it's part of China, because the people who, aside from the minority ethnic group, which no one wants to talk about anymore, but the rest of the people they actually are migrants who left China in 1949 under Chiang Kai-shek, and they always wanted to go back to China. They wanted to re-invade China. But America stepped in and said, no, we don't want you to re-invade China. We want you to stay in Taiwan. And it took about 20 years or so for the Taiwanese to realize, okay, we'll stay. And so they stayed. And so America was actually the country which enabled the creation of Taiwan. Without America's support, Taiwan would never have become a country or a nation. But it is essentially an extension of the military of China. And so this is a family dispute. This has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with you. It's like you can talk to your neighbor and say, look, the relationship between your cousins and your uncles and your sisters and brothers, yeah, I'd like to give advice, but I'm not going to intervene in your family dispute because, once you do that, it's very nasty. But what you have with China and Taiwan is this, essentially, it's a brother family sibling dispute. And the vast majority of Chinese, the vast majority of Taiwanese don't want war. They just want to get on with life. As one Taiwanese said to me years ago, why can't we just make money? I mean, that's sort of Max Weber was wrong. He said that only Protestants were interested in making money, the Protestant work ethic. He was wrong. He'd obviously never met a Chinese Confucian because it's the same culture. They're very good at making money. Look at China today. Look at Taiwan. Look at Singapore. Wherever you have Chinese communities, they're very good at building a community. They're very good at finance. And so for me, my answer is, well, let's go back to what America did very well in the past, which is building the institutions for peace, building the institutions for prosperity, and let's focus on that. And if there are disagreements, let's disagree. Nothing wrong with disagreement, but there's no reason to start a war over semiconductors in Taiwan.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I mean, objectively, like, I don't like the Chinese form of government. I don't like totalitarianism, whether it's fascism or communism or globalism or technocracy or whatever. But historically, Taiwan is, part of China, and it's the military-industrial complex of the American empire that sort of brainwashes us to make us think, it's in the military-industrial complex's interest, not mine or yours. And what do you make of? I guess tonight, there's this debate with Kamala and Trump, and I didn't even know. Honestly, I don't even care. I'm not following those sorts of things. But what do you make of the state of America, this talk of civil war, and the end of American empire?
Well, that's a really good question. That'd be a podcast discussion in itself. And in my book, I detail what America did in East Asia in the 60s and 70s. And I'd have to say, like, I've studied empires. I studied, where Australia is a former colony, a dominion of the British Empire. But the reality is that America was the only empire. Japan did a little bit, but America was the only empire that had this remarkable idea of actually laying the foundations for building nations, other nations, competitors in a way, future competitors. Rebuilt Japan, they rebuilt Germany. And in East Asia, they were of vital importance to the history of South Korea, Taiwan, a little bit Singapore, and Japan. And so this is a remarkable thing. America is the only empire that thought, well, if we want to be strong, what we need to do is actually make a valuable, a sincere and genuine, out of our own strategic interest, of course, it was to protect the world from communism at the time, but it wasn't superficial. And so that's America's lasting contribution to a lot of these countries. And that's why there is still a lot of support for the United States, because of this, in a sense, this growth through strength through numbers, or this sort of expanded new version of empire. Is very different from no other European empire has done it. So the Dutch were in Indonesia for 300 years. They did nothing for the people of Indonesia, nothing. They treated them like animals. The Japanese were enough said. The who else? The Portuguese. They treated their colonies like animals, monkeys. The Spanish were the same. The brutality of the Spanish towards virtually everywhere they went. The French also a little bit like America. I'd say America, France, England, maybe. The French have this idea of everyone is part of France. And so there's a little bit of, I guess, paternalism there. The English to some degree, but look what they did to India. Look what they did to Malaya. What a bit of a mess. Singapore. And Australia, of course, we're still living in a legacy. And the funny thing is, for Vore, we're told we have to support Ukraine because we have to support the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian people and their sovereignty. We don't have territorial integrity and sovereignty because our sovereign is King Charles. He lives on the other side of the world. The Australian crown is the British crown. We're not a republic, the same with Canada, the same with New Zealand. So we don't have territorial independence. We don't have sovereignty because we're actually part of the Commonwealth of British Empire. So Americans, I think they have this tradition of building other nations as part of their empire building. And this is a tradition that they need to go back to. And they need to reappreciate because as I said, they did it for their own strategic self-interest, but at the same time, they did something. Whereas no other European empire has ever actually done anything positive. The only thing you can say about former Portuguese colonies and former Spanish colonies is they speak Spanish and Portuguese and maybe a few of the food. But that's it. There's been no transfer of anything else beyond that. But the Americans were different. And unfortunately now, because America is facing intense competition from China and from other countries, America, the elite, the ruling class, have given up on the idea of cooperation. through international institutions, and now they want to have a war to defeat Russia, to defeat China. And that's a disastrous policy. That's a stupid policy. It's far better to go back to the institutions that they've built and work through those institutions. And of course, when Trump says, I mean, I heard him say the other day when he was trying to talk about childcare, he was asked about childcare, and he sort of goes off to, I think he was ended up talking about trade policy. And his idea was, he said, we're going to tax all the other countries. I don't know how it relates to childcare. We're going to tax all the other countries, and all that money will come into America. And I think as a result of putting a tariff on everything, we'll have enough money for childcare. But Mr. Trump, you do realize that everything in Walmart will increase in price. Everything that American middle class buys will increase in price, like refrigerators, TVs, fax phones, everything, televisions, everything will increase in price. And so the middle class, yeah, there might be money for childcare and there might be money for something else, but the middle class will actually find it more difficult to survive because Walmart will go out of business. It won't be selling cheap commodities anymore. It will be bankrupt. And so the middle class will get sort of stabbed in the back. But, as long as we're making America great again. But it is interesting, Havor. I'll say one thing about Trump's trade policy in his first administration, and that is that he was like a child. It wasn't a mature trade policy. And he was against multilateralism. He said multilateralism is not in the interest of the United States. He said that we can't negotiate with lots of countries. We can only negotiate with one country at a time. And so that was America's trade policy under Trump. But in 1995, in the World Trade Organization, Uruguay round, America negotiated with over 100 countries at the same time. It was the biggest trade negotiation in history. And America has the largest trade bureaucracy, bigger than China, bigger than Japan. And these hundreds and hundreds of bureaucrats negotiated with 100 countries at once. And Trump says, we can't do that because it's not in our interests. What it is it's a different understanding of the role of America in the world. And so when he talks about making America great again, it's about perception. Because in the 90s, America believed they could advance their interests in the world as a superpower. Now they don't believe that. And so the question for me is, when did it change? When did they lose this self-confidence? Because the Americans could easily negotiate with 100 countries at once with their hand tied behind their back. But Trump says, no, we can't do it. We can't do it. So his trade policy had its beginning in 1934. So Trump's trade policy was basically rewriting the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act and bringing it forward to 2017. I thought, why? This is 100 years out of date. Trust the bureaucrats to do a deal. And, they're very good bureaucrats. You don't want to mess with the USTR. The USTR usually gets what they want. And unfortunately, with Trump and with Kamala and Biden's trade policy, is this idea that we can't negotiate with China. Why not? Because they're our enemy, that they won't respect us. Well, it's a question of perception. It's a question of maturity. I'm pretty sure that if America went to China today and said, look, here are a list of demands. This is what we're prepared to give you. Let's restart the trade round. Let's have a proper trade round. China will say, yeah, sure. Where do I sign? If it's to postpone war, everyone will jump on board, but they just don't want to do it anymore. And I think it's because they think they'll win a war. They'll win the war, and nobody wins a war. I mean, Australia's getting ready for war, as you probably know. And next year, the most important holiday in Australia will be our War Memorial Day. The local New South Wales government has banned trading on that day. On Christmas Day, you can still go shopping. On Easter Day, Sunday, you can still go shopping. On Good Friday, you can still go shopping. But our most important day, Anzac Day in April, all trade will be banned because we must support war. And we must support the marches and God bless Australia and go off for war. And I watched the march this year, which was on Anzac Day. And when I was a kid, I used to watch these marches. And you know the difference between the marches when I was a kid and the marches today is that there are almost no veterans marching because they're all dead. The World War One guys, they're all gone. The Korean War ones, they're all retirement homes. World War II guys, most of those have passed away. There are, of course, the ones who served in Timor and Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. But the vast majority of those who are marching are current service personnel. And so the message that sends me is Australia, we want to have a proper march. We want more veterans marching. We want more people to get killed, more people to die in another war. But unfortunately, this isn't the Boer War or even World War II. We have nuclear bombs now. And so, these long-range missiles that the Chinese invented in the 70s. And so they go a long way. And so every capital will be affected. And it doesn't matter really how many submarines Australia builds. We're going to build. Did you know about our submarine program? The Chinese, I think, have over 100 submarines, but we're going to build 3 submarines, 3 or 4. It will cost 300 billion, 400 billion or something. And they'll come online in another 10 or 20 years. But we have to make sure the war doesn't start until then. Otherwise, we won't be able to use them in a war against China. So we have to rely upon American nuclear submarines and British submarines. Of course, they'll be here protecting us when China is bombing America, right? They're just going to get in their boat and go back across to the other side of the world.
I mean, that's insane what you said about the holidays. That makes me think in the Bible, it talks about towards the last days that you'd have, I think, some leaders that come to power where they're like gods of war. They I think the words that are used like fortress and the fact that you're outlining in Australia, it's like what's held in most esteem is it's not Christmas or religious holidays, but war. It's like war has become this god. It's especially in the West. It's absolutely insane. And so, what in the face of everything we've looked at, fascism, totalitarianism, war, like we're in this fourth turning again. This cycle, this Kondratiev wave, Elliott wave, whatever one wants to call it. What can us, the little people, do wherever we are? What are some of your thoughts on the way forward, hope, and whatnot?
I think that's a really good question, Laura. I think we need to accept what we can do and what we can't do. I'm not a protest person. There's a big protest happening today in Victoria against the military-industrial complex. We have an annual fair of bombs and missiles, weapons to kill people. There's a big protest about that. I'm not really big on protesting. I'm more of a revolutionary sort of person. What's the point of a protest when you can have a revolution? But for me, it's a revolution of the mind, our own being, the world in which we live, which is the people we know. I think we need to be courageous in talking about our own faith and for me, it's my Christian faith and how important Christ is and following him each day and trying to live a life that is pleasing to him. That's important to me. But also my political beliefs are important in talking to people about not being afraid to talk about things. And we live in this self-censored world. Certainly in Christian circles, there's a lot of self-censorship. And in academic circles, there's a lot of self-censorship. If you say all the right things, you'll get a nice career. Your career will go in a different direction. But at the end of the day, there's something called self-respect. And if you don't have self-respect, then you don't really have much at all because you are just a parrot. You're just copying someone else. And I don't think people around you will respect you. They'll just, he's another yes man. He'll just say whatever. And you meet these people who they won't say anything publicly. They refuse to because they don't want to lose their job. And I call them cowards. I call them, there's an interesting line in the movie where there's this Catholic priest who gets killed at the end of the film. I think it's called Calvary. He criticizes one of his sort of deacons. He says, you're not a bad person. You just have no integrity. And I think that's such a powerful insight because he's not criticizing someone's morality. He's questioning there's something wrong with that person by their lack of integrity. And we need to be people of integrity, true to who we are and what we believe in. and we can make a difference in the world around us. I also don't believe secrecy. I don't believe in violence. I believe in non-violence. Gandhi was right where he takes from Christianity all the things that the British Empire had expunged from their understanding of God. What I find remarkable about Gandhi, he could read the New Testament and understand Jesus, but he could divorce the teachings of Jesus from the Christian version of the British Empire. He was mature enough to realize that they were not the same thing. And I think we need to go back to the New Testament and rethink the identity of Jesus, what Jesus is saying to us today, and how we can be people of love, people of compassion. How do we change the world? I think one person at a time. We have to remember, of course, that Jesus, that's how Jesus interacted with people. He was friends with everyone. Everyone respected him, even the Pharisees. People say, oh, the Pharisees hated him. You don't have that many conversations with someone you hate. It's all part of the debate context. He was reasoning with them. They were reasoning with him. He'd argue with them. They would argue with him. But he kept the door open, and he kept the dialogue open. And I think that's what we've missed. We're missing in our culture, in our political cultures. We talk to our friends. We don't talk to our enemies. We don't try to build common ground between people. We like to divide. And the other thing is, I think you probably noticed it, Havore, with social media, is that people go berserk if someone says, one word or one syllable out of line or something that may offend you in some way. Then there's blood on the ground. They just go berserk. And I don't know what it is. Why is it immaturity? Maybe we've all become children again, or what is it? Is it a sign of sort of this kind of cultural version of Alzheimer's where we're all reverted to childhood? What is it? It's a strange culture. We need to challenge the culture and we need to subvert it. And it's a strange world, Havore, where you'd have to say, well, if you go back to Jesus, you're actually being a revolutionary, you're being a radical, you're being someone challenging the culture. And that's exactly what it is, because you have to stand up for what is right. And even if the whole world stands against you.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, Jesus talked to everyone and you try to find common ground. And I've been like that all my life. And when I started the podcast, that's why I reach out. I have on people who are of a plethora of views, some that are, in terms of ideology opposed to mine, but there is some common ground, which is the reason I bring them on. And we have dialogue. And now I'm a Russian agent for doing that, according to Washington. But also what you said, I think, that's a great advice that I've always had. For me, the greatest respect throughout my life have been for the people that have had grit, integrity, stood for what's right, character. Money was, I don't even think about that. And sometimes I've met people who have been, who are people who have money, but are empty, narcissistic. And, those types of people see how they can one up you. They calculate self-worth and, worth. And so, I don't have the money. They've got me on that one. So they are superior. But I mean, in my view, I've got that, that the character, and I have some social currency to speak. And I've had people, those types of people, attack me and try to take that away from me and get jealous for that. And so, I've mentioned in the past, I've looked to people like Sterling Hayden, who was this, man with grit, and he had fame and fortune, but he didn't care for it. And I think we just have to stand for what's right. And, COVID was a test. I had on Mike Donio not long ago, and he wrote a great article saying it was a test. Were you willing to, suffer, whether it was your job, or your relationships or whatever? And so we need more people to be willing to lose more and sacrifice. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to, during COVID, quit, or I wasn't put in that position. But yeah, we've covered a lot. Michael, if you've got any other thought, and then again, let us know the best place to find you and your projects.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the comment you made about the person who called you a fascist. And I think if you know what you're doing is right, and if you are committed to your belief system and you're on the right path, that these sort of slurs, and they are slurs, and they're designed to discourage you, and they're designed to I guess pull you off the path. And I'd encourage you to just keep on going and staying true to what you believe in and your principles. And there's a lot of words sort of being bandied around these days, and they're designed to discourage us. And the whole Russia thing, the persecution. I went to Russia. I went to Russia last year. We had the broadcast from Russia. But the thing is that we live in very perilous, dangerous times, and I don't think people understand how perilous and dangerous they are, and they don't understand the horror of war. When I was serving as a priest in the country, I got to know a lot of men who were in the Vietnam War, and they're a great bunch of men, but all of them, they were still living with the consequences of that conflict, and it was you could see it in their eyes, the way they talked, everything. And this was like so many years ago, and they'd never recovered. And I knew some men who were in Afghanistan, and I always salute the soldiers for fighting for their nation. I think it's an honorable profession. And if you're called to do that, then absolutely, stand up for your nation, whether you're Russian or Ukrainian, whether you're in Israel or Gaza. God honors the professions. He's not condemning either side. God never takes sides in war anyway, but the consequence of war, and on September 11, we are still living with the consequences of what happened on 9/11, is that these terrible events, they have repercussions for generation after generation and for family after family. And I don't believe that people really understand where we are and where we're going, is that we're at war with Russia. We're about to go to war with China, and it doesn't bother them. And it doesn't bother them. And we have the rise of totalitarianism, we have the rise of fascism, and they don't see it. And they're completely oblivious to it. And there's this sort of delusion. And they go to church on Sunday and they sing songs, and they hear sermons that they've heard before. Their minister gets the sermon off the internet. There's very few people who are plumbing the depths of the Bible, trying to understand what God is saying to us today. And I think that goes back to your question that you said, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? And the answer is, well, we may not be here when he comes back because of our stupidity to have another war. The other thing is that, Havore, when we're called to go to war, and as it was in the case of World War II and World War I, and a lot of people say, why aren't there so many Christians today? Well, because Christians were killing each other in the last two world wars, and people see the hypocrisy. They say, you're a Christian, but in World War II, you were at war with other Christians. You were killing people who call themselves Christians. World War I was the same. In China, there are more Christians than there are people in Australia. In Russia, they're all Russian Orthodox, or the old Orthodox, or whatever they're called. So once again, we're being called to kill other people, not only made in the image of God, but also who call Christ Lord. And instead of the churches standing up and saying, no, we won't support war, no, we won't support conflict, they're saying, where do we sign on the dotted line? And it's like, for me, Havore, I think it's like I came to the realization recently that nothing has changed. We haven't learned a thing since the 19th century. And I truly believed, when I was writing this book, it goes in some very dark places. It looks at Charles Darwin. There's a problem with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. I explain it all in here. There's a big, big problem with it. No one wants to talk about it. Again, that's a taboo subject. If this would get me banned from universities. You're not allowed to talk about the relationship between Thomas Malthus and Darwin. Oh no, that's a taboo subject. But the thing is that at that time, they really thought the world was going somewhere, that they were learning from their mistakes, that they were evolving as a society. And for that 20 years or so, there was this optimism. And then they have the Great War. And then 20 years later, they have World War II. And now we're going off to World War III. And it's like, guys, you haven't learned a thing. So Freedom Matters Today stands up for freedom from a Christian perspective. My website, freedommatterstoday.com. Try and get the books while they're still available. I hope that I don't get cancelled because of my trip to Russia last year, or my book Is Russia Our Enemy? But you never know. You never know what might happen. But I do worry about the surveillance state, of course, and but the great sadness, of course, of worry, which you probably experience and feel, is that it's like you're talking in mute in a crowded room. It's like you are shouting in mute, and no one is listening, no one cares, but it's in mute, and they go, what are you saying? Oh, wait a sec, there's something on the TV. Wait a sec, there's something, computer game. They're not interested, and you're talking about the most important things about life, and they don't care. They really don't care. And my encouragement to you is fight the good fight, hold the line, because if we do survive World War III, our children and grandchildren will say, well, Granddad, you did the right thing. You made the right choice. And I will just end with the story of the non-church movement in Japan. They were Christians who withdrew from the institutional church. They formed the non-church movement. They are the only Christians in Japan who are respected because they stood up against tyranny in World War II. They stood up against fascism, and their books are still available today because they held the line against tyranny 100 years ago, when Japan, when the emperor was, he became the head of state and everyone had to bow to the emperor. They refused to do that, and their books are still being published because they refused to bow to tyranny. And so maybe, Hivore, in years to come, your podcasts will be available to a new generation of post-war people, and they go, wow, this guy really knew what he was talking about. What a shame nobody listened to him. And but it doesn't mean that the message that we have is not valid, because we're standing before God, and we must stand before him one day and give an account of our life, and we must do so with a clear conscience. And for me, that's why I do what I do, because I'm not looking to the popularity or to the money, but I'm looking at, I want to stand before God with a clear conscience that I did what was right. And that's my approach. And I'm sure that's your approach too. And we just have to keep moving forward.
Yeah, when people talk about money, or if it doesn't really happen, but if anyone accused me as a podcaster trying to get money, it's like, I wouldn't even be doing this. Like there would be no, if I was motivated by money, I'd be doing something else. But what you just said was my greatest frustration. And I've never heard anyone put it in such a great way, where you're at a party or somewhere and you're on mute, and it's like nobody cares. And I've wondered for 20 years. And I think this is our biggest problem. I'm just astonished at the everyday person around me here in Mexico, in America, in Kazakhstan as well, where I lived. They just do not care. And that's one of the reasons I carry on with this podcast, because of that. I can't not do this podcast, because I need to talk about these things. And that's why, talking to people such as yourself, I get that, intellectual, spiritual stimulation, as I hope my listeners do as well, because I've got listeners, paid subscribers, who say wherever they are in Europe or elsewhere, everyone around them is they feel the same, that everyone is just concerned with the carnal, the mundane. And again, the Bible tells us to forget the carnal, look up to the metaphysical, the spiritual. And I thought of Ecclesiastes as well when you said we haven't learned, nothing is new under the sun. I still think since ancient times nothing has changed. We've never learned. I don't think we ever will. And it's funny when you mentioned progressivism, progress, Darwin. I just learned the other day that in the Greek or Latin, utopia means nowhere. So basically, we're on the road. Cobra Commander Klaus and his transhumanist company are leading us literally to a road to nowhere. And so great chat, Michael. People can I'll include the links in the description to our past couple chats on TNT radio and your books on freedommatterstoday.com. People can purchase them in digital form as well. And so thank you again for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
No, it's been a great pleasure, Havore. It's been a wonderful conversation and great chatting with you. And let's do it again. Let's absolutely do it again. I'm glad that actually you're outside of TNT, because there's a longer format and we can just talk and relax, and there's no ad break in the middle, and it's easier to have a broader, longer conversation. And I wish your podcast all the best, and all your listeners all the best, and may God be with us each day, I think, as we seek to stand up for what we believe in and keep moving forward.